Hello there, you're watching the Press Preview, our first look at what's on the front pages as they arrive. Over the next half an hour, we'll be talking through the headlines with the Financial Times' Whitehall editor, Sebastian Payne, and the Daily Telegraph's assistant comment editor, Olivia Utley. So a very good evening to both of you. Nice to see you both. So let's take a look then at what's making those front pages. And the Metro leads with the outrage stemming from Facebook's decision to block content from news outlets on its platform in Australia after the social media giant objected to a new law there that would force it to pay content providers. It's also the lead story for The Guardian, which focuses on accusations that the move is undemocratic. The Daily Mail hears people as young as 40 who aren't clinically vulnerable or frontline workers could be given their first dose of COVID-19 vaccine by the end of March. The Daily Telegraph carries promising news from a vaccine study, taking them to believe to cut infection and transmission rates by 2/3. And the French President Emmanuel Macron has spoken to the Financial Times, insisting that the US and richer European nations should set aside up to 5% of their vaccine supply to send to poorer countries. So Sebastian Payne and Olivia Utley here to go through some of those front pages with me. And Olivia, you've picked out the Daily Mail's front page, first of all, which has an interesting headline. It says over 40s to get jabs by the end of March. I mean, that's a lot younger than we would expect and a lot quicker than any kind of timetable we've heard before. So where does this come from?
Well, so I think the quicker element, it's been a bit strange, actually, in recent days. A lot of people have been noting how, after having such an impressively quick rollout for the first 2 months, the new set of targets all actually sounded quite unambitious. So basically, all this is saying that if we keep going at the rate that we're going at, then we should be finishing the next band by the end of March, by the end of next month, rather than by the end of May, as it was going to be. So that's the sort of speed element. Then in terms of the priority list element, there's been this discussion going on in government for a while over whether key workers should be bumped up the priority list ahead of different age groups. So it's this question of whether, you know, a 30-year-old teacher or a 45-year-old big man should go ahead of the older group. They have decided against that and sticking with the age policy, which I think was relatively predictable, because at the moment the government doesn't seem to be linking the vaccine rollout that closely with the easing of lockdown. And the only purpose in sort of getting key economic workers vaccinated quickly would be if the government was using the vaccine to ease lockdown quickly. So I think both elements of this story are actually kind of quite predictable. But of course, it's brilliant news that we are going fast enough to get for over 40s to start being vaccinated in the next couple of months.
Well, yeah, that's really encouraging. Obviously, Sebastian, if that could be achieved, what do you make of the way that we're hearing about it here on a front page? And the government has been cautious in its estimates up until now. What do you make of the way it's coming out, and also this sense that key workers may not be prioritised?
Well, we've actually known that the JCVI, which is the independent committee that decides who gets vaccinated when, they've always said that age has to be the priority. And in terms of professions, that's a question up for the government. And I think it's been reported, and I've certainly heard from senior folks in Whitehall, that doing it by profession is very complicated, and creating demarcations around certain jobs is difficult to do. So they're going to stick with age for the moment. This issue on when people get it is a really fascinating one, because at the FT this week, we did some number crunching, and we figured out that if you were to maintain the level of 3 million jabs, that's the level we've had for the past 2 weeks, then all over 50s would have 1 jab by the end of March. Now, the government's target for all over 50s is the end of April. So that means one of two things. One, they're expecting a dip in supply, which would be quite concerning. But again, people in governments are saying that may happen. There'll be some dips, but they're not expecting a big drop off. Or two, there's a lot of expectations management going on here, because we know Boris Johnson has come a cropper many a times for over-promising and under-delivering. It seems he's now flipped it round and is under-promising and trying to over-deliver there. So I think this Daily Mail front page is just the sort of thing Downing Street doesn't want to see. They don't want people getting far too far ahead of themselves and excited, because that'll only increase the demands for lockdown to ease sooner. But, we saw another great set of vaccination results today. Almost 500,000 jabs are delivered. And if we keep up that rate, it's a very impressive thing. And of course, it's not just the Pfizer and AstraZeneca vaccines. We've got the Novavax vaccine. That will come online very soon. You've also got the Moderna vaccine and the Johnson & Johnson vaccine. So really, we should actually be looking at increasing the rate of vaccinations, not just stabilising it. So I think my view is ultimately there might be some blips in supply, but fundamentally the government is just trying to calm down expectations, because it doesn't want to rush down out of lockdown too easily. If things do go wrong, it doesn't want to get the blame for it, as we saw when everything that went wrong did go wrong pretty much in 2020.
Well, yes, and I think most people would agree, Olivia, wouldn't they, that the vaccination rollout, certainly to date, has been a success. And the Financial Times is interesting because they've got an interview, haven't they, with the French leader, Emmanuel Macron, talking about what those richer countries who do have supplies of vaccines, at what stage they distribute them to poorer countries, because clearly the point is that the whole world needs to be protected if we're going to stamp out a pandemic.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's a very admirable thing that Macron would like to do here. What's happening is that in African countries, the vaccine is being sold through intermediaries. Obviously, companies like AstraZeneca are giving the vaccine away at cost price to developing countries. But there are these intermediaries who are hiking up the price, meaning that African countries are buying it, tend to be buying stocks of vaccines at a higher price than Europe. Obviously, that's not ideal in any way. And Macron here is suggesting that European countries should start giving vaccine supplies to African countries. And he said that he's saying that Merkel is on board with the plan in theory. I think it's, this is classic Macron. It's a very statesman-like gesture. It's a very, we Europe can help out gesture, and it's impressive. But I'm not sure if it's going to go down particularly well in France. Macron isn't that popular in his own country at the moment. The rollout, as we know, in Europe has been a bit of a disaster. And also, he's got this huge problem going on in that the French tend to be quite anti-vaxxer, and they come very close to the bottom of every chart showing willingness to get the vaccine. So he's got that big problem on his hands. He's got the problem on his hands that Europe didn't get enough vaccines in the first place. They were complacent about signing those deals and just didn't get it over the line fast enough. So far behind us in the rollout. And now he's offering to give away vaccines, which of course is admirable and, as you say, necessary if we need to stamp out the pandemic worldwide for the vaccine to work at all. But it'll be interesting to see how this goes down domestically.
Well, yes, and from Britain's point of view, the Guardian picks up on what Boris Johnson is likely to say at the upcoming G7 summit. The suggestion that the UK could start to give away vaccines at some point. At what point is that, Sebastian?
Well, I think it's once the most vulnerable have been vaccinated. That is, in the UK, the top 9 groups, which is all over 50s, all those extremely clinically vulnerable and clinically vulnerable as well. And as the UK government has said several times, that once you vaccinate the top 4 groups, which we've now done, that should cut 88% of deaths from COVID-19. Once you vaccinate the next 5 groups, you cut an extra 11%. But most crucially, you ease all the pressure on the NHS. And we've also seen news this week of new drugs and new medication coming on that really help with the worst effects of COVID-19 too. So I think once you get past that point when you're saving lives with vaccinations and the most vulnerable being vaccinated, then you do enter this question of helping other countries in that situation. A lot of people have warned about the rise of vaccine nationalism and the idea that countries will just hoard vaccines for themselves. And I think it's pretty admirable that Boris Johnson is trying to get on the front foot here and following Emmanuel Macron's suggestion of saying that you need to look to other countries to on this. Now, obviously, there will be a backlash. There will be people who will say, well, we need to keep them more from ourselves and more for other countries. But of course, if you look at what's going on in Africa, those are countries that have very poor healthcare systems. They don't have anywhere near the medication, the testing, the ventilators, all the things that have helped us do our best against this disease. But there's also a geopolitical element we should mention as well, that China and Russia are trying to roll out their versions of COVID vaccines, which haven't been approved by Western medical regulators, very, very quickly to Africa. And there's a big chance that if these countries swoop in and they do very well in rolling out their vaccines, that when it comes to future diplomatic and political decisions, they're going to look to the countries that gave them the vaccines. That's really at the core of what Boris Johnson and Emmanuel Macron are saying tonight, that it is the duty of Western countries to promote our values, and we do that through helping with our medicines. So I would imagine from the UK's perspective, once we get past the first jabs for those top 9 groups, which will be somewhere between the end of March and the end of April, then I think this question of distributing vaccines will start to enter the fore much more quickly, because of course, hopefully by that point, we'll be exiting lockdown a bit here too.
Interesting. And on that subject, turning to the metro, Olivia, we've talked about the pressure for lifting lockdown restrictions. We get the announcement from the Prime Minister on Monday, of course. And today's figures on infection rates and the drops are going to play in to that announcement, aren't they? What's the Metro telling us about these figures?
Yeah, just story after story is telling us, and Metro again here today, that the data basically couldn't really be much better. Infection rates down by 80%. And then we've got Telegraph, which we're going to talk about soon, which shows that both our main vaccines help reduce transmission by up to 2/3. That's much better than anyone was expecting. Hospital admissions are already down and will go down further, because obviously cases lag behind. Admissions lag behind cases. So basically everything is going in exactly the direction we wanted it to go. And I feel like I should be touching wood here, because, basically it couldn't be better. So we're looking at, we've got Boris Johnson is there with his, thanks Seb, Boris Johnson is there with his 3 different roadmaps for easing out of lockdown. That's what we're all being heard. That's what we're all being briefed. That there's this one extremely optimistic scenario, a mid-level scenario, and a pessimistic scenario. And it's all going to depend on this real life data, which is going to be coming in now and over the weekend. As far as we can see so far, all the data is moving in the right direction, which would imply that, it's got to be this most positive roadmap. But the data is still coming in. It's a very, very fluid, live situation. And I don't think even Boris is going to know right up until sort of Monday morning exactly what the roadmap's going to say.
Indeed. And today's data appears to show that the lockdown is certainly having an effect. It's not clear whether the vaccine is having an impact on those figures or not. But there is this front page story on the Telegraph, Sebastian. We really haven't got very much time to talk about it, but tell us what you can briefly about it.
So Public Health England has been doing this big study into how COVID vaccines cut transmission, because we know they develop antibodies, we know they help stopping serious illness, but for getting out of lockdown, you've got to cut down transmission. And there's some very good initial data for the Pfizer vaccine from Israel. The Telegraph's front page says the PHE study, which is landing on Boris Johnson's desk tonight, shows similarly good results. And as Olivia just said, if this is borne out by the full data the Prime Minister receives, then we should be on a pretty good trajectory for getting out of lockdown quite quickly, because the vaccines will stop illness, but crucially stop transmission of COVID-19 too. So fingers crossed this is borne out and the vaccinations just keep on going.
Well, indeed, I think fingers, toes, everything crossed. But we'll get no information until Monday, will we? But we're going to take a break right there. Lots to talk about coming up after the break, including, is Facebook being undemocratic by banning news outlets in Australia? We'll be talking about that next. You're watching the press preview. With me tonight, Sebastian Payne and Olivia Utley. And Sebastian, we're turning to the front page of The Guardian next because their main story focuses on Facebook. They say that they're under fire and accused, they say in the subhead, of trying to bully a democracy with a block on news sites. So talk us through it.
So the Australian government, led by the right-wing leader Scott Morrison, is about introducing legislation that would force social media companies to strike deals with news publishers. And this all comes back to the issue that all advertising revenue has basically gone out of print publications and into digital places like Google, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, you name it. And so this law is making its way through the Australian Parliament at the moment. I think Google has struck a deal with News Corporation, for example, in Australia, but Facebook has, I think, to use the technical term, thrown its toys out of the pram here. It decided to block all news content on Facebook in Australia. So that's 18 million Australians who use Facebook now can't read any news content at all. And this has been attacked widely by politicians in the UK, in Canada, in Australia as well. And it's saying that Facebook is using bully boy tactics because it doesn't want to strike these deals. Facebook in return says that this law put forward by the Morrison government as a fundamental misunderstanding of its business model. This all comes to a clash that all countries are facing with in terms of the power of these big tech companies. There's some big antitrust cases set to start in America that could lead to Facebook having to divest some of its properties like WhatsApp, like Instagram, for example, with that feeling they've got too much power and are trying to overrun the democratic wishes of people. I think when you look at what's happened in Australia, those fears might be borne out by a little bit of reality there, but I don't think this has done the social network's reputation any good whatsoever.
Well, yes, and I suppose we shouldn't be surprised, Olivia, that newspapers take a dim view. The front page of the Metro as well, #delete Facebook is their headline there. But what do you think the implications are? Presumably there'll be countries around the world watching what's going on in Australia, because this battle and this debate about freedom of information is a big one.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting what Australia's done here. Personally, I think the Australian government was quite brave and sensible to do this, because for so long, big tech has basically been profiting off newspapers while newspapers stink. So, offering free content from newspapers online, not paying the newspapers for that content and profiting off that content. It doesn't seem fair at all. But I completely see, it looks pretty petty of Facebook to have done this, but I actually completely see why they've done it from their perspective, because Facebook is now fighting quite a lot of different battles on different fronts. They've got this, giving people news for free is a big part of their business model. That's under threat over in Australia and will be around the world soon. Then there's a question of whether or not they're a publisher or a platform, whether or not they're responsible for the content on their page. The fact that they banned Donald Trump suggests they are responsible for the content that goes on their page. But if you're saying that, then you're opening a pretty big can of worms, because obviously there aren't enough Facebook employees to monitor what every single person on Facebook is saying every day. So they're fighting a lot of battles on different fronts, and they're desperately trying to win them all. So I do see why they put up a fight against this. But from an outsider's perspective, it just looks terrible. It seems like classic evil big tech, because not only did they block Australians from seeing the news, they also blocked them from seeing sort of government announcements about things like forest fires. And in this story here in The Guardian, there's a case of domestic abuse help site was taken down by Facebook.
Okay.
So it's sort of this big tech that really doesn't look good.
Indeed. Well, we must leave it there for now. But Olivia and Sebastian, always good to get your take on things. Thanks very much indeed.